to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Perry Boyle of MITS Capital. He is one of the co-founders of this company and the CEO, and one of the things he does is bringing capital to the Ukrainian defense industries. Um, and working to get Russia out of Ukraine, trying to help Ukraine get into NATO's defense supply chain. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that today in depth, and also about broader issues concerning the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the defense industry, and its impact on Russia's military strategy as well. But to start with, Perry, could you tell us a little bit about how you founded your company and how you decided to focus on Ukraine and on defense?
Yeah. I spent 35 years on Wall Street. I founded an investment bank called Thomas Weisel Partners. My last long-term stint on Wall Street ended in 2020. I had worked for 15 years at a global hedge fund, and then I retired. My kids were grown and left the house, and I retired. Um, but I am a student of geopolitics. I've got a master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I've been on a couple think tank boards. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about America's role in the world. And when Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, it disturbed me. It disturbed me on many levels. Um, and a switch went off in my head that, oh, I thought we were the good guys in America. I thought that America was a superpower. I thought that Russia was afraid of the US. And then I realized Russia doesn't fear the US, that the US security guarantees to Ukraine weren't real. And we were going to let Ukraine fall. I mean, I think people forget now, almost 4 years ago, the consensus was that Kyiv would fall in a week. Okay, now it's 4 years later, and Ukraine is still a sovereign and independent country. But so that was my motivation, was really moral outrage. Previous to that full-scale invasion, I knew nothing about Ukraine. I have no Ukrainian heritage. I'd never been there. I could pick it out on a map. I have no background in defense. I have no background in venture capital. But I just signed up to help. And my message to people in Ukraine was, I'm the wrong guy, but I'm here, and I'll do whatever I can to be helpful. So, together with two Ukrainian gentlemen, my partners Dennis Gurak and Anton Melnik, we founded MITS Capital. We officially launched it in January of 2024. And we started with a defense technology accelerator, which we still run. It's called MITS Accelerator. We run it in Kyiv in partnership with American University Kyiv. And we've graduated two cohorts from that, and we've just selected a third cohort, and we'll start that process in January. And alongside of that, we've raised a venture capital fund, MITS Lightning Fund. It's a US fund. And in that fund today, we have 11 investments. And as the companies that are currently going through the third cohort of the accelerator graduate, we will take them into our venture portfolio as well. So by the end of the first or second quarter, we should have somewhere between 17 and 20 companies in our venture portfolio. So this has been really kind of a 2 year process.
Mhm.
And at close to 20 companies, I think that makes us the largest portfolio of venture-backed defense technology companies in Ukraine.
That's
We also,
really amazing.
yeah, well, we also have, I think, the largest team dedicated to Ukraine on the ground. We have 25 people in Kyiv. They are attorneys, they're investment bankers, they're defense industry experts, they're technologists. And Ukraine doesn't have an established and well-defined venture capital model for its defense industry, such as you might find in the UK or the US. And so we're working to build that. And a lot of the companies that have arisen to create tools for the warfighters in Ukraine, for the defenders of Ukraine, um, are not the traditional kinds of companies that venture capitalists invest in the US,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you may have a situation where somebody on the front line realized they had a need for a certain kind of drone to do certain kinds of missions, and
Mm-hmm.
that person may have a friend in Kyiv or Lviv who could make that drone for him, and they create this drone, and then they start selling it back to that combat command. Um, well, that's perfectly reasonable, but in the US, that would be considered a conflict of interest, that the guy is working at the combat command that's buying his product, right?
Mm.
So this is an example of something that we would have to clean up before that company would be investable by a European or American investor. And so this is why we have so many people on staff, is what we're trying to do is help de-risk
Mm-hmm.
investing in Ukraine to bring more investment into Ukraine.
So, in terms of de-risking, have you encountered a lot of problems or obstacles related to the messaging from the US administration, from the media concerning the alleged corruption and various corruption-related scandals in Ukraine, including in the defense procurement sector,
Yeah.
and things like that?
Yes, and in fact, there's been very little venture capital invested in Ukraine's defense technology space relative to what one might expect,
Hmm.
given the quality and price point of the products. And I think it's uh, for multiple reasons. Corruption perception being one of them. And I have, as an American operating in Ukraine, I have never been confronted with a corruption issue.
Hmm.
Okay. And we routinely ask our companies that we're invested in, like, are you running up against this? And the answer is no. And we will not participate in any activity like that. You
Mhm.
know, um, we need the process that we're implementing to pass European and US due diligence so that future investment can come into the companies in which we're working with. So we reject corruption. But one of my partners says the difference between corruption in Ukraine and corruption in Europe or the US is that in Ukraine, corruption is illegal. And I think a great example is what happened with the NABU and Zelensky's legislation, and then people literally turned out in the streets
Hmm.
and nonviolent protests. No no cars were burned, no storefronts were shattered. It's not like the protests you see in the U.S. Peaceful protests saying this is wrong and fix it, and he did. And to me, that's an example of democracy in action.
Mhm.
Uh, but also, you know, the European Commission is having its own very parallel corruption scandal to what Zelensky is going through. Von der Leyen, she's had to dismiss some ministers. There's a investigation going on there. The parallels are rather eerie, I think.
Hmm.
And so is there corruption in Ukraine? I'm sure there is. Have I experienced it? No. Will my companies or my business participate in anything like that? Absolutely not. Do we need to be successful? No.
So how do you get this message out? I mean, US has had its own share of conflicts of interest in the defense
Yes.
sector, and we've had the scandal with Boeing taking shortcuts and producing subpar products and importing aluminum from Russia and all these things. How, but nevertheless, Boeing's reputation is such that despite all these scandals internationally, it's still one of the top leading industry leaders. But for
Well, I
Ukraine, it's
think
an
I
uphill
yeah.
battle.
Well, it's good to be a monopoly or a
Hmm.
semi-monopoly, right? I mean, you only have two choices for commercial aircraft
Hmm.
of that size, Boeing and Airbus. China's working on their aviation industry, and then there's smaller planes. But like, what's your option? You
Hmm.
know, and Airbus just had a big recall on their software on some planes. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, but how do we change the perception? That's you know, I don't think, Ukraine should be out there saying, "Hey, hey, pot, you're calling the kettle black here." Like,
Hmm.
I think they just need to. I think Ukraine has done a remarkable job at uh, at showing the world the resilience of its people under stress. And um, the number one thing I think that could counter this perception is EU accession.
Hmm.
Okay. And the EU process um, should be accelerated. And
Hmm.
the more Ukraine is integrated into the EU, I think the less this perception will be out there. And of course, they should prosecute these ministers, and do all the things that a normal democracy does to protect its the integrity of its economy and its justice system.
So that leads me to a question related to what you said, this resilience. And this resilience propelled Ukraine to shift from a defense importer to a rapidly scaling manufacturer, even under very active wartime pressure. How did it manage to do that in such a relatively short period of time?
Well, um, I think there's been a misperception about Ukraine's defense industrial base.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was a major exporter of defense products. During the Soviet times, Ukraine was a major producer of components into the USSR's defense industry.
Mm-hmm.
Their rocket program, their their turbines for their helicopters. All this is produced in Ukraine. So Ukraine has a strong history of a solid defense industry. The challenge was it was, geared to building legacy Soviet stuff. And they have pivoted and pivoted very rapidly and very effectively to the new warfare. Um, when the Russians invaded, Ukraine didn't make drones. Thank God for Turkey. Turkey provided the drones that helped turn that tide. But the Ukrainians are incredible engineers. A lot of, you mentioned Boeing. I think Boeing still has 1,200 software engineers in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, it's a huge outsourcing for IT, for computer science, for engineering, for material science. And that expertise has been channeled into the war effort because it has to be. Um, the Ukraine now makes somewhere between 60 and 70% of the materials it uses on the front line. And while it is known for drones, today Ukraine makes more howitzers than the rest of NATO combined, right? So it we need to figure out how to how to get the Western press to pay more attention to what's going on there and the realities of it. Um, it's it, and now Ukraine will start exporting, and I think that this is very important um, for Ukraine to have a durable defense industrial base post-conflict. It's going to need to diversify its customer base from the war against Russia to the greater defense of Europe
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully the rest of the free world, like even into Asia. So I think what Zelensky is doing in terms of loosening up on the exports is timely and necessary and something that
Mm-hmm.
we at MITS Capital have advocated for. And we are working with our companies to secure them export contracts today. And we've been successful with many of our companies in doing that. So there's more being exported from Ukraine, I think, than people perceive right now as well. Uh, so you asked a question earlier that I didn't quite answer.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the impediments to investment in Ukraine's defense industrial base. I thought when I started naively that it would be easy to find
Mm-hmm.
investors to invest in Ukraine's defense. It has been very difficult. And I think one of the reasons is I went initially to the countries that have defense industrial bases: US, UK, France, Germany. All those countries have been very generous to Ukraine in terms of military aid, but only for weapons produced within those countries.
Mm-hmm.
They do not provide Ukraine with any investment in Ukraine's domestic defense production capacity or purchase from any Ukrainian defense producer. And and I think the light bulb that's gone off for me is that countries with a defense industrial base have no interest in Ukraine having a strong defense industrial base.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why would they invest in and create Ukraine as a competitor to them when they know Ukraine's products are better, they're battle tested,
Mm-hmm.
and far cheaper than anything produced in a NATO defense industrial base? So, distressingly, it feels somewhat sometimes like um, the countries with defense industrial bases are using Ukraine as a testing ground for their own production rather
Mm-hmm.
than trying to build up Ukraine as Fortress Ukraine, as a bastion against, you know, I think there's a saying in Ukraine, nothing good comes from the East,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, um, we need to build up Ukraine's domestic defense industry capabilities so that they're not caught the way they were 2 years ago or 4 years ago. And it can be a stronger deterrent to Russia even attempting this the next time, because there will be a next time. I mean, we've got hundreds of years of history of Russia trying to exterminate Ukraine as a culture and a political entity. And so we've got to build up what's in Ukraine, for not just the defense of Ukraine, but for the defense of the frontline countries of Europe.
Something a little bit provocative, because it's not an immediate thing that comes to anyone's mind. Looking at India, which on the one hand is looking to diversify its own industrial base with much more quality Western weapons, but on the other hand, it's still heavily dependent on Russian weapons, which are also much cheaper. Do you think Ukrainian industry could be the answer to that dilemma?
Yes and no. So it already is.
Mhm.
So take all the Russian helicopters that were sold into India. Those are serviced by Ukrainian companies,
Mm,
right? The Motor Siege factory is one of the in Ukraine is one of Putin's war objectives to capture that factory. Um, yeah, India is a very difficult one because is it a customer? Is it a competitor? Is it allied with the West? Is it allied with the East? It plays all sides. I think they just bought another raft of S-400 missiles from Russia,
mhm,
and that's a direct benefit to the Russian war effort when they do that. I think India has also been evaluating the F-35 against the Su-57. Um, from from India's perspective, I would think that they're going to go with the Su-57 because it's cheaper and
mhm,
because they can do domestic production of Su-57 parts and domestic maintenance of the
mhm,
Su-57, which the United States does not permit for the F-35. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you buy F-35s, you're locked into Lockheed as for servicing and for supply chain of parts. And Lockheed's ability to sustain the parts supply chain has been terrible, for F-35 programs around the world.
Mm. So it's kind of almost a vanity project to some extent.
Well, yes, but when the U.S. acted as a superpower and had its implicit, there was a benefit to buying U.S. weapons because they came with a call option on the U.S. military. And that doesn't really exist anymore under the new administration, right? So why would you spend for high cost American defense products when when they don't come with a relationship? You might as well buy from Saab or from Dassault or
Mm-hmm.
Leonardo, right? So, and I think that's what's happening. And I think the U.S. is going to lose substantial market share in the defense industry because of its only America first foreign policy.
Now, looking at Europe, and it's got its own set of dilemmas with the collective defense um,
Yes.
infight over, we've seen a few countries grow together and co-produce or buy from each other, and shifting away a little bit from the dependency on the US. But at the same time, we're still seeing a lot of disagreement and disunity and lack of consensus on what European collective defense should look like. And I'm wondering whether Ukrainian products could be part of the answer to this conundrum, given that they're inexpensive, in some ways are better than what is currently on the market, and they're not from any of the competing internally European countries, so they don't create the sense of internal rivalry.
Yeah.
What are some of those specific technological niches that Ukraine has this superiority, competitive advantage towards, as opposed to other NATO producers?
Yeah. Many.
Mm-hmm.
And so I despair that it is going to happen in the way that would be optimal. Okay.
Mm,
I think France, Germany, the UK in particular use their defense budgets primarily as jobs and political programs rather than to optimize their defense.
mm,
The UK, very generous to Ukraine, will not buy drones from a Ukrainian producer, but they will only produce drones in the UK to ship to Ukraine, for example. Or take France, which makes one of the best howitzers in the world, the César, um, but can't make a tank. Like they literally cannot make a tank. They have not made a tank in 17 years. They've not designed a tank in 35 years. They've only got 400 tanks left, of which only 150 might be able to be fielded at any one time. And they had an agreement with Germany to joint produce a tank that won't be produced until 2040, I think. So, you know, Europe is not serious about defense. And I think it's because they just always expected the US to do this for them.
mm,
And so Trump has shaken them up in many ways, but there's no leadership within Europe to create that relationship, that leadership that has been lost with the American pullback.
mm,
So what I think is most likely to occur is um, I think the countries that receive the most threat from Russia and that are in Russia's um, plan for reestablishment of the empire, which would be the Nordic countries, the Baltic states, Ukraine, obviously. But Putin has also talked about the fourth and final partition of Poland, right?
mhm.
So you, if you look at a map, it's pretty clear what border Putin wants to draw between Russia and Europe. And that will be very bad for Finland. Estonia, Denmark, most of Poland. Um, those countries need to get their act together and they need to stop relying on this fantasy that NATO can defeat Russia in the field. Okay, NATO cannot move an army to the border of Russia in less than 45 days. The roads aren't there. The bridges aren't there. The tunnels are too short and narrow. Like they literally cannot get the equipment to where it needs to be to fight against Russia. And then when they get there, none of those troops have been trained in drone warfare.
Hmm.
Right? And we see the average life of a soldier in the frontline zone in Ukraine, once they've been spotted by a drone, is 9 minutes. Okay, 9 minutes. That's the death zone now runs at least 10 kilometers aside, and it's moving up to 40 kilometers aside, where nothing can move because the drones will take them out or call in artillery to take them out. As far as I can tell, other than this concept of a drone wall, which is very non-specific, there is no comprehensive strategy for how to defeat an army that comes from the east into Europe, especially one that is drone enabled. Um, and my recommendation would be that certainly the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, including Finland, they have to stop coordinating their militaries. They need to start integrating their militaries.
Hmm.
Each one of those countries on its own has a military that is subscale and inadequate for the defense of its own country. Finland can hold off Russia for quite some time because they have militarized the whole society. 900,000 men have a carbine in their house and can be called up mobilized within 24 hours. Like no other frontline country has that heft.
Hmm.
So Finland will, and it's a 1,500-kilometer front, right? So Finland will probably be not the first thing that Russia goes after. But what's going to happen in the Baltic states? Russia can get into those capitals in a matter of days. And once they're in the capitals, NATO's comparative advantage in air superiority is rendered useless because what are we going to do? Bomb Vilnius to get the Russians out? I don't think so. Um, you don't defend territory from a distance. You defend territory from occupying it. And this is why Estonia and Poland are begging for more NATO troops because they know they cannot defend themselves against a concerted Russian invasion today.
Hmm.
And this is ridiculous if you think about it. Russia's a country of 140 million people, an economy the size of Mexico's versus the European community of 500 million people with an economy 10 times that of Russia.
Hmm.
Russia's militarized. Europe is not. And um, and I think we misread Russia dramatically in terms of what their intentions are because we
Hmm.
ascribe to the world what we think, right? And we've grown up in liberal democratic countries where the individual has rights, and this is not how Russia operates. This is not what their political philosophy is. This is not what they're taught in schools. This is not what they hear in their media. They hear that Russia is a victim. It is a victim of Western aggression, that the war in Ukraine is a defensive war.
Hmm.
I mean, just think about that for a minute. And that they need to defend themselves against Europe. And the only way they can do that is by recapturing their former empire and liberating those people from Western decadence. I mean, it's logically inconsistent, but it is what this philosophy of Eurasian expansionism is. And 20% of the people in Russia don't have indoor plumbing, right? It's not an economy that is run to maximize the benefit of the entire population. It's
Mm.
an extractive economy built on extractive industries that can be controlled by a kleptocracy that resides in a single city, Moscow, right? So I think the GDP per capita in Moscow is similar to what it is in Warsaw or Paris or Rome. The rest of the country has a GDP per capita less than China's. So we don't understand Russia. And if we don't understand it, we're not going to be able to deter it or defend against it. And the fact that we can't deter it is obvious, right? They're not scared of the US anymore. They're not scared of NATO anymore. If they were, they wouldn't be fighting this front or refusing to negotiate a peace in Ukraine. And there are at war at Europe already. Like if you live in Denmark or Belgium, like your airport's been shut down by Russian drones already. If you live on the Baltic Sea, they've been cutting power and internet cables between the countries. Like they blew up a DHL airplane. Like what more do we need to know what Russia's intentions are? Um,
So, in terms of that, we're seeing that Ukraine has incredible potential, but how sustainable is it? How can it continue to expand its defense industry without long-term Western guarantees for financing, licensing, and supply chain?
um, yeah, so that's a great question, and I would succinctly answer no, it cannot. And it requires investment and customers. It requires diversification of the customer base and it requires capital investment in production capacity. That's why my company exists to foster both of those.
Hmm.
But if you look at the structure of the Ukrainian defense industry, it is very suboptimal and
Hmm.
not competitive in that you have the state-owned legacy defense industry, Ukroboronprom, that has some excellent companies, but they are largely companies of the past in some respects.
Hmm.
And then you have the hundreds of companies of the present and maybe the future that are subscale and that need to. It's like the auto industry in the United States in 1905 or 1915, right? There's just too many of these companies. Ukraine lacks domestic defense primes. And listen, we don't need to replicate what's going on in the US with five guys controlling the entire, trillion-dollar US budget, but there needs to be a scale option for Ukraine, something
Hmm.
where these companies are bigger
Hmm.
and are more robust with financial controls, with accounting systems, with regulatory compliance systems that can pass European and US level due diligence, that can be financed by European banks. This is what we're doing with MITS Industries. So, um, my company, we've created a platform for a neoprime. We're trying to build a neoprime for Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have the internal financial resources to do this.
Hmm.
So we're partnering with Denmark to do it.
Hmm.
Okay. Because Denmark has money, technology, European compliance, governance things, all the things that people worry that Ukraine doesn't have. But it does not have a defense industrial base sufficient to defend its country. It needs what Ukraine makes.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's the perfect partner for this. And we have assembled several Ukrainian companies and aggregated them together into something that has some substantial heft. And our goal is to capitalize it with some Danish and European equity, and then layer on some debt from the European Commission and build something that can be an acquisition platform to to acquire these subscale Ukrainian companies and get them to scale, and then create something that can trade with other European countries, components, integrate manufacturing, leverage some of the defense technology that's sitting dormant in some European universities, like create a
Mhm.
partner for the defense of Europe. And this is why we talk about integrating Ukraine into Europe's defense architecture. Um, it's not just sell Ukrainian drones to Europe. It needs to be much more deeply integrated. And then we need to bring the experience of Ukraine's warfare to European militaries. So you could put the best drones on the best army of Europe today, and that army would fail because it doesn't have the logistics to run drones. It doesn't have enough drone operators. It doesn't have the platoon structure to integrate drones into the fighting system. So we have to stop looking at drones as a product
Mm.
and start thinking about this as a system that has a lot of different aspects to it that need to be fine-tuned. And so we as MITS Industries will bring not just Ukrainian products and technology, but also Ukrainian experience and training to its partner countries, to what should be Ukrainian partner countries.
So is that something that Ukraine can export, meaning its expertise in drone warfare to train these unprepared European militaries?
Sadly, Ukraine has a lot of wounded veterans who are very experienced in this, who want to keep
Mm-hmm.
up the fight. And yes, they're perfect for this process. And Ukraine needs to find ways to integrate veterans back into the economic system of Ukraine. And this is just one vehicle that where we can do this. And I'm very excited about this.
Anything to this process from a legislative perspective? In other words, does
Yes.
mm-hmm,
Yes. So, yeah, sometimes, I feel like Ukraine is its own worst enemy. I think a lot of Ukrainians probably think that too sometimes. But um, yes, Ukraine has some non-useful restrictions on IP export, on technology export that do not serve the interests of the nation. And I think that because it's so obvious that they don't serve the interests of the nation, that this will change. And we
mm-hmm,
already see this trend occurring. Okay, so Ukraine has set up Defense City, one of these virtual free trade cities, uh,
mm,
patterned off of Dia City. Ukraine is easing up on the export restrictions, so it's going in the right direction.
mm-hmm.
I would like to see the pace accelerate. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it is going in the right direction because it has to for the good of the nation.
And what do you expect to happen next in that sense? Is there a specific goal that you're projecting, that you're working towards? Is there a specific step that has to occur next?
Yes. Well, I normally like to exude enthusiasm and positivity, but it's very hard to do that given the war situation in Ukraine today. And we're talking early December 2025 today, right?
Mhm,
And the US has shifted its policy from, you know, under the Biden administration, the US would provide enough defensive weapons for Ukraine, and now it doesn't. Okay, the US doesn't provide Ukraine with anything that Europe won't pay for, right? There's nothing
mhm,
coming from the US taxpayer to Ukraine anymore. And it's even worse than that. I mean, if you looked at the 28 points or the 19 points, like that is not a path to peace in Ukraine. That is a path to a pause in a war where Russia can build up its military capabilities while giving Europe and the US an excuse to ramp down Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Like
Mm-hmm.
it would be suicide for Ukraine to accede to these peace plans.
Mm-hmm.
What so I think it's going to be a cold and dark winter. And I think that the momentum today has shifted to the Russians on the
Mm-hmm.
battlefield. Um, I'm hoping that Pokrovsk and some of the humanitarian situation the Russians are perpetrating on Ukrainian people will motivate Europe to do the right thing and step up. Indeed, the only path to a just and durable peace in Ukraine is the defeat of Russia in Ukraine. Everybody's scared to say this or do it because, oh, Russia's a nuclear power. Okay. Well, so's France, so's the UK. Like, and it's just so unrealistic to expect that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons because they would have already. If they were going to use tactical nuclear weapons, they would have done it already. They failed in their war aims for over 2 years, right? They've 0.8% incremental gain in 2.5 years. Like Russia is not winning this war, and Ukraine is only slowly losing this war. And it's really become a test of wills, not between Russia and Ukraine, because they are both in this to win it, but between China and Europe. Okay, as long China could end this war tomorrow, it just has to tell Russia no more, and the war is
Want
over.
for obvious reasons.
Which it won't because it's making too much money on it. Politically, it's gaining because it's destabilizing the West. Like
Mm-hmm.
this war really serves China's interests. And by proving that the United States is afraid of a nuclear threat such that it will not engage. Like if you think about it, Russia rattles its nuclear saber, and Jake Sullivan in the Biden administration says, "Oh, we can't help Ukraine." Okay. If that's true for Ukraine, that's true for Estonia. That's true for Taiwan, because nothing would be fundamentally different if Russia was invading those countries or China was invading Taiwan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really told the world that the US is not the guarantor of peace and that any authoritarian country with a nuclear weapon can grab whatever it can take. Okay, so on the flip side, Europe doesn't seem to be interested in defeating Russia. And I don't understand this because it's so clearly in Europe's strategic long-term interest to keep Russia in as small a box as possible. So I try and figure out why is this? And the Belgians kind of gave us the answer, right? The Belgian prime minister says, well, first of all, we're not going to steal Russia's assets. Okay, financial. The Belgians are already stealing Russians' assets. They're already stealing the income off those assets for the Belgian economy and not sharing that as they're legally required to with the rest of Europe. So the hypocrisy of Belgium is just shocking, and how they can stand in the way of this loan to Ukraine is appalling. But the Belgian prime minister actually said it is not desirable for Russia to be defeated in Ukraine. He said that. And just the other day, I think, wow, that that shows such a disregard for history and for Belgium's history. Here's a country that was occupied twice and has never won a war. So, and who benefited from the Ukrainians' sacrifice of holding off the German army, bleeding out the German army in the East in 1942 to 45. So, like how soon Europe forgets. Um,
I'm not sure it's the issue of forgetting or it's the issue of not of essentially only getting what you expect. If you allow each individual country to sort of hijack this collective process, then that's what's going to happen. Look at how Hungary has gotten away with
yes.
assorted mechanisms for years until finally its vote was suspended. But it took how many years before that happened?
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Well,
and
yeah.
Belgium is also the seat of the European Union, so it kind of was able to get away with sort of telling everybody else what to do while not walking the walk. And I honestly think that Brexit was part of, was directly linked to that. It wasn't just the Russians co-opting the process. Of course, Russians are opportunistic and will look to any division to cause problems, but I do believe there is honest dissatisfaction with some of these hypocritical and self-serving individual agendas, and even on the level of the current Mogherini corruption scandal and everything,
Yes.
and there's also the simple fact that the Ukraine war needs to continue for the Europeans to ramp up their own capacity, which takes time. They
Well,
simply
that
are
is,
not able to
mhm.
defend themselves, and that is another explanation, which is understandable but not particularly helpful at the
Yes, that is
moment.
true. Well, and then you think about NATO and what its purpose is. Like NATO was founded to keep the Russians um, out of Western Europe
Mm-hmm,
when the Soviet Union controlled up, through much of Eastern Europe, right? East
mm-hmm.
Germany, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, like the communist horde from the East. And then that fell after 89, right? The Western Europe expanded into Central Europe and pushed back that horde from the East.
I think the Yalta Conference was the biggest mistake of the 20th century.
Oh, no question. But so now you have these 30 countries in NATO, they don't share the same interest anymore. Like, why would the Russians aren't coming for Spain? The Russians are coming to Spain. They go to
Mhm.
Marbella and spend a lot of money, right? So why would Spain want to defend itself spend 5% of its GDP to defend itself against Russia? Like,
There's a problem for Spain. The Russians have been aligning with the Spanish separatists, with the Catalonian separatist party, and they've been doing the same in Scotland, and they've been doing the same in California. I
yeah,
mean,
and I'm
albeit
sure
with
they do
much
the
less
same the
success.
Northern League versus Southern Italy and all that. Yes, the Russians will always try to sow confusion, dissent in a Western country. But my point is that there are countries in Europe, though, that do need to fear Russian expansionism that don't share necessarily the same interests of the rest of Europe. And that's the North Baltic 8 countries, that's Poland, that's Ukraine, right? These countries need their own alliance. And individually, they are not strong enough to stand up against Russia. To
Haven't there
collectively, they
been
are.
models? The model, the eight, the eight state alliance, hasn't that been a model in the past and to some extent even now? What is the status of that?
Well, I think Nordefco, which is the military, mini lateral
Hmm.
of the Nordic states, I think they've been very successful at collectively buying uniforms.
Hmm.
That's about it, right? So, um, I think they have some other things like, one military can move through the territory of another country and all that kind of stuff,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
it's not an integrated fighting machine. And that's what you really need is an integrated fighting machine, an integrated fighting system.
You
Um,
need exercises. You need joint interoperability, not just of weapons but of forces, and you need
yes,
these trainings. Um uh, you need all of that, and right now we're just not seeing a lot of that, even though those countries have been honestly dedicating a lot of money to Ukraine's defense, to their own defense. But money alone is not enough. You need a system. And my question is, why do we not see that happening? And can Ukraine's uh, kind of defense posture facilitate that process in some respect, given that Ukraine is in a live or die situation? It's in an existential crisis right now. Those
Yes.
countries are facing an existential crisis, but they're not there yet. They're not invaded yet. Ukraine is fighting for its existence as we speak. Can it actually be the factor that brings these countries together?
I I can't answer that question. You know, I wish I could.
Let me
That
put it this way.
yeah.
Can I'll be more specific. Can Ukraine's industrial capacity change the logic of Western military aid and posture from supplier to co-producer, which is what needs to happen for Ukraine to start playing a more leading role in also helping reorient
Yes.
the
Well,
posture of at least smaller countries?
Arena, I am doing everything I can to spread that message. That's why I'm on your podcast, right? Like
Hmm,
this is my mission. And I will, I'm doing what I can with my own money, obviously my own time. Um, and uh, uh, I feel like there is some positive momentum in this.
hmm,
And Russia's gray war has catalyzed
hmm,
the the fear that needs to be felt to respond to an external threat, but the mechanisms for how those countries are responding to the fear are not um, adequate to create what they need to do to actually defend themselves. So what I'm kind of doing is let's just get small wins. Let's go for baby steps and then hope other things happen. Like if 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 Denmark is really convinced that they need 250,000 drones, which isn't what they need, but that's what they're convinced of,
hmm,
okay, well let's help them get 250,000 drones. And then they'll realize, oh, we need the training and we need the logistics supply, like they're going to waste, not just Denmark, all these countries are going to waste a lot of time and a lot of money reinventing the Ukrainian wheel. And and what I've observed is that countries cannot learn the easy way. They
hmm.
learn the hard way. And in a way, it's Russian gray war attacks are a positive catalyst for this. Um, but the people don't fear. And until the people fear to a level where they're determining election outcomes in these countries, the response will be suboptimal.
It's interesting because Romania just had a couple of very interesting responses. First of all, the president coming out and saying that that the country is corrupt, and second, we've seen the struggle to respond to the drone invasion, and I don't
Yeah.
hesitate to call it for what it is: not a provocation, not an incursion, but an invasion, because that's what
Yes.
it was, an act of war by a foreign state actor. And we're seeing that even countries that are in the zone of danger directly, they're so polarized or so hindered by internal processes that they're not yet capable of the sort of very directed existential level of response that needs to happen for Russia to start getting the message that they will not be met with open arms, and it's going to be, in fact, quite the opposite if they continue with their current course. Um,
Yes. And so what I think to me, the catalyst that would motivate the Scandinavian, Nordic, Polish militaries to get shift from peacetime to wartime
mhm,
mentality, sadly, is going to be the sacrifice of the Baltic states. And it won't be until Russian boots cross another European border that the Europeans figure out what's coming for them. And why the Baltic states? Because the Slovakia Gap, if you're a Russian, that's the natural border with Europe. And those countries, 6 million people, less than 6 million people combined, 25% of the combined population is Russian,
Hmm.
many of whom refuse to assimilate into those countries. And they just don't have the arms or the defense industrial base to defend themselves. And just 5 years ago, yeah, just 5 years ago, I graduated from a graduate program in international relations at Fletcher with many Eastern European politicians,
Hmm.
military people who woke up every morning believing the U.S. would protect them from Russia. I wonder if they wake up today thinking the U.S. is going to protect them from Russia because there is no evidence that the U.S. will do that. In fact, the evidence is all shifted to the contrary.
We may have a change in that sense in 3 years, but I don't think anyone has 3 years. I think if any such attack will occur, it will happen before the 2028 election in the US. And
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Well,
in
the
meantime,
U.S. has its own internal divisions that Russia and China and that Russia and China feed into,
mhm,
such that I don't. The U.S. has become very internally focused and very Western Hemisphere focused. We've
mhm.
withdrawn military assets from around the world to deploy in American cities and on the southern border of the United States. And now our military seems focused on
Parking drug
protecting
boats.
America from Venezuela. Like it's
I
yeah.
mean, it seems to be, a huge waste of resources to strike missiles into fishing boats with drugs when something much lesser. It's like trying to kill a sparrow with a cannonball, but as
Yes.
far as I see, it's a huge. I'm not saying that those things aren't bad. I'm just saying that they could be handled with significantly lesser use of force. But it's interesting. Let's talk about logistics. Ukraine has managed to balance secrecy, rapid innovation, and even mass production under current wartime conditions. But what would it take for it to actually ramp up capacity to be able to co-produce or deliver weapons to Baltic states should they wake up
Money,
and just Mhm.
money, just
Investment?
money. Yeah,
Mhm.
investment. Yeah.
So could those smaller states, could the Baltic states, for instance, be navigating their path away from this internal European myopic uh, brain freeze and start doing their own individual bilateral or
They are.
unilateral?
They
Hmm.
are. In fact, Estonia is one of the countries that Ukraine has sold finished drones to,
Hmm.
right? Because and Estonia has been very loud and vocal about the need to defeat Russia in Ukraine to protect the rest of Europe. But still, there's not enough money in those countries to move the needle. Like they can't afford to defend themselves.
Some of these Nordic countries have traditionally looked to Germany as their sort of protector. I don't think Germany is quite ready to take on the leading military role, though some, willpower seems to be there. But to what extent can it be helpful at the current stage financially, in terms of investments, if nothing else?
Well, it can be very influential, but Germany has its own problems. Okay, the German
Hmm.
economy hasn't grown in 4 years. Germany industrial production is seems to be in a secular decline. Their auto industry is getting crushed by China, and they to the Energiewende, if I pronounce that correctly, they have dramatically increased the price of electricity in Germany such that Germany is not a competitive industrial economy anymore. So, this German miracle over the past 80 years um, is starting to fade, and
Hmm.
there's no new thing to drive the economy. They're not a player in AI. They're not a player in robotics. these they're not a player in the economy of the future, and they can be. It's going to require a big shift in national priorities. But so Germany is, and then you have the cultural legacy, and then the fact how many Russians are there in Germany? It's like a lot,
Mhm.
like 4 million or something. I heard. Can
Yeah,
that be
it's
correct?
a very significant number, and unclear how many of them are, you know, actual
Yes.
infiltrators, fifth columnists, to put it
Well, it doesn't
very
really take
bluntly.
very many, but this is one of my things that I'm just fascinated by the Russian expatriate community. They don't speak out against Russia.
Hmm.
Almost none of them do. You know, they portray themselves as victims of Putin. Yeah, and you know, it's
Personally, I
it's so
think the
different. It's so different than what you got from the East Germans or even the Hungarians who left the country, or the people who or the Belarusians,
mhm.
who are much more on a per capita basis, against the regimes. Yeah, it's something in the psyche. I don't
Well,
get it.
I think one major mistake that everyone has been making with analyzing Russia's defense posture is the fact that they seem to be relying psychologically on the presence of very significant Russian ethnic diasporas in various Western countries, even in the United States, but
Yes.
certainly in Europe. And if we look to it, that there is some connection between the Russian regime and at least some segments of those communities, from
Yes.
a counterintelligence and defense perspective, it creates an inherent zone of influence, sphere of influence for Russia in those countries. Not only
Yeah.
as an excuse for invasions supposedly to liberate the ethnic Russians from their local influences, which it certainly is going to happen. That's not even a question. But in terms of having ready-made force, assistance force, not all of these people will have access to classified information or defense,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
defense capacity. Many of them are probably going to be pretty useless, as we have seen in Ukraine in the start of the war. But nevertheless, that is something to count on in at least in smaller countries or in border areas where in case of a massive conflagration, every little bit can help. So my
Yeah.
question is, given this Russian reliance on these pockets of Russian speakers and pro-Russian sympathizers in various places, what does it say about the international um, positioning vis-a-vis Russia's prospective aggression and expanding footprint and asymmetrical warfare and even potential expansion of conventional invasive tactics, that they are not really counting these communities, taking them into consideration of protecting their own societies and preparing for a war, because I hear a lot of talk and panic about war in Europe, but I'm not seeing the steps that it would take to prepare a
Yeah.
society for war. Certainly, I'm not hearing what economic steps would need to be taken, what things will need to be cut from the budget to, in order to shift to a wartime budget. Certainly, if you expect a war, you would be preparing for it, and if you're expecting
Well,
a war, you would
well,
need
well,
to.
I don't know that that's entirely fair, Arena, in that Europe is stepping up its defense spending pretty substantially. I think the challenge is they don't know what to spend it on, right?
Mm,
And especially if you have a domestic defense industrial base, you're going to spend it on, just increasing the production of the current companies, which isn't what is needed to fight the current and future war.
mhm,
So it again, it's not a total oblivion. It's not,
mhm,
but it's just very inefficient and ineffective.
mm,
I think part of it is a media, Russia is very effective at propaganda,
mhm,
and Ukraine is not. I think Ukraine is terrible at public relations, frankly.
mhm,
Um, and I can understand why they want to put all their resources into war material, but
mhm,
they could do a little better job at stating their case internationally. And I'll give you an example. The New York Times, if you read their coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's not the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the New York Times. It's the war in Ukraine.
Mhm.
Okay. If you look at the journalists that they have covering the war in Ukraine, they're Russian. They're Russian journalists. They're people who were born in Russia or schooled in Russia. Even the Americans who cover the war in Ukraine went to school in Moscow. Like
Mm.
they don't have balance in their coverage. And this is the New York Times, which is the most influential media source in the United States. So Ukraine needs to do a better job at this. I mean, I and then sadly for Ukraine, like Israel is a very dominant news cycle issue in the US and crowded Ukraine out of the news cycle at just the time when Ukraine needed the most help in the US. So,
In some aspects, deliberately so, by the way, with Russia actually playing a very big role in making sure that's exactly what would happen.
yeah,
Um,
well, I don't know that I'm going to agree with that, but um, you could be right, but I don't have any specific knowledge to say that. But yeah, yeah.
they've
So,
certainly boosted the propaganda cycle
oh
specifically
yes,
to distract from their own battles and foibles. And but I think far bigger than the news cycle is the clear fact that we have political leadership in the US, but also in other countries that has simply um, handled this the wrong way. There's no better way of saying it.
yes,
And the other big aspect of that is the fact that non-Western countries have been either not engaged or have been allowed to be co-opted by Russia. And the biggest example is the situation in Sudan, which just offered a naval base to rent to Russia,
yeah.
something Russia has been craving for many years to have an African um, naval base and to expand itself as a naval power. And this is what I wanted to ask about that. How does that figure
Oh,
into
so I've
the
spent a lot of time in
equation?
Africa. So
Mm-hmm.
prior to MITS, I was the chairman of BOMA, BOMA, which is the largest African provider of poverty graduation programs. So, I've spent some time and I've seen Russian and Chinese influence in Africa. And Sudan is a really interesting case because since yeah, I think since 2005 or the past 20 years, the United States has given $6 billion in aid to Sudan.
Mm.
Okay. Last year, 2024, it was 1.25 billion. In 2025, it's been about 250 million, right? So no other country, including Russia, has given that kind of money to Sudan. Okay, so why does Russia get a navy base in Sudan and not the US? Okay, because Russia has been propping up the regime in Sudan with weapons. Okay, they basically bought the regime. So the United States is a very generous and humanitarian country, has done a lot for the people of Sudan. The people don't govern Sudan. The junta governed Sudan, and Russia owns that junta. And so that's why they got the Navy base. And U.S. foreign policy needs to. So, I agree with the Trump assertion or the MAGA assertion that we weren't getting a good return on our foreign aid. I agree with that. Okay. But blowing it up
Mm-hmm.
isn't the right response. Um, and it's going to cause, tens of millions of deaths, of incremental deaths, which is just sad. But Russia has been very smart in going to authoritarian countries in Africa to lock up minerals. So I'm very good friends with some people in Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
And Wagner Group is considered a positive thing in Nigeria, not a negative thing.
Hmm.
Because when the Russian paramilitaries come into an African region, they provide stability, they provide peace. Okay, the one definition of a state is the monopoly of violence within the borders, right? When the Russians come in, they take over the monopoly of violence there. Do they steal and rip off from the country? Do they take its gold? Do they take its resource? Of course they do. But those people weren't getting the gold anyways. So
Hmm.
they don't, they just see, oh, my children aren't being, kidnapped, my daughters aren't being raped. Like, I've got some stability here. The Russians are better than what I had before. So, and this is the brilliance of Russian foreign policy.
So, what do you expect to happen to the Red Sea and nearby security as a result of Russia potentially acquiring that base? How will that impact the US posture? How will it open affect the freedom of navigation? We already know Russians have been helping Houthis target American ships and so forth.
So, if you look at China's approach to its expansionism, the Chinese are brilliant.
Hmm.
They will never fight unless forced to. They almost never fight. They just keep building up incremental power and just chip away at things. This is what they're doing to the Philippines right now. This is what they're doing to Taiwan. They're not going to invade Taiwan. They don't need to. They just surround it with the world's largest navy and say, hey, US ships, you can't come through the strait anymore. The chips will keep flowing. And then over a 20-year period, they'll do to Taiwan what they did to Hong Kong. They'll take away its democracy piece by piece with a combination of carrots and sticks. And they'll use proxies wherever they can, right? So China funds Iran, Iran funds the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, right? This is brilliant geopolitical strategy. It isolates China from having to militarily fight, be, but it uses its economy and its every soft power means and every gray war means to expand its influence and power. Um, and we have no tools. Democracies have no tools to counter the gray war tactics of the autocracies. This is, there should be, I haven't given enough thought to this, but
But we
that's where I
did.
would be focusing if I was in grad school today,
During the Cold War, we certainly did. The controlled chaos strategy was not only by the Soviet Union. The US and its allies were engaged in very much mirror
Of course.
tactics. And we were also engaged in counter propaganda and uh, all sorts of operations. So, the Trump administration and quite frankly, the administrations before him have all chosen not to prioritize that. Um, but that's a choice. That's not for lack of potential tools, and it's not for lack
No,
of
no, that's true.
historic
That is
examples.
true. But you
Um,
mentioned the Red Sea and the Gulf, and so I would think that there's some people in Europe and the US who say, well, it's not a problem because oil is going to become less important as we go into the green sources. Well, that is just pure fantasy, okay? Because we we are going to be consuming hydrocarbons as long as they're cheap and energy dense. Um, it's just economics. And the if everybody in the world lived at the standard of living of the average European, total global energy consumption would be 5 times what it is today. Okay. So don't the Indians have the right to a high standard of living? Don't the Zimbabweans have a right to, don't the
mhm.
Bolivians have a right to this standard of living? They think they do, and that requires energy. So energy will be a key geopolitical battle forever, or at least for our lifetimes on this podcast. And Russia and China are brilliantly playing energy. They are low-cost producers. Um, electricity electricity costs in China are half that of the US. and 25% of that in Europe. So, how can the US and Europe compete industrially with China when the major factor of industrialization, energy, is the low cost over there? No one's thinking about this strategically in capitals.
Do you expect that we'll have even more challenges with freedom of navigation, with transportation of weapons to and from Africa and the Middle East? And
Absolutely. Freedom of navigation is definitely going to be a challenge. So, I post a lot on LinkedIn, and I posted this today. Um, I have this thesis that the U.S. is the high cost producer of defense,
mm-hmm,
and China is the low cost producer of defense,
mm-hmm,
chiefly because of energy. But maybe the U.S. can't produce defense at all when it
mm.
comes to its Navy. Okay. The U.S. at any price cannot build a naval ship. Okay. And won't have the capacity to do that for at least 10 years and maybe never. Um, Meanwhile, China is the low cost producer of shipping. So the US Navy is going to shrink. The Chinese Navy is going to expand. The Russian Navy is a joke. Okay. My favorite ship in the world is the Kuznetsov, their aircraft carrier, because it costs them $500 million a year to keep running, and it can't do what it's supposed to do. But yeah, the US is going to lose as a naval power. Oh, I
Well,
rendered you speechless, Arena. This is an
no, no,
accomplishment.
I did want to say, I mean, for Russia, it's a huge expand. Why does it need even, this base? What does it mean for its strategic power? Is it just symbolic projection of maritime power, or is there something more to it? Does it seek alliances with local powers like Turkey, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia? And does it hope for a stronger relationship with those countries
Mhm.
as a result of
I
this?
think we'll need another hour for that, Arena, and I'm going to run out of time in a second. So, but I would love to come back and talk to you about all of that. I mean,
It,
I'm very much enjoying the conversation, and we're getting into some really important stuff.
well, the bottom line is we are seeing Ukraine has a huge potential. Still, we are coming up quite short in terms of financials, in terms of commitments, and in terms of countries figuring out what they actually really need at the current point in time.
Yeah.
Hopefully, that will start to change as a result of reality hitting the ground.
Yeah,
In
Ukraine is the key to European security. It is the asset for European security. It must be denied to Russia because Russia will use the military of might of Ukraine for its next phase of war on the Baltic states. And um, it, I mean, 40 million Ukrainian people want to be European, want to be part of the EU, want to be integrated economically with the world's largest economic bloc. It just make Europe should be embracing Ukraine rather than just keeping it, dangling it, keeping it alive.
To end on a curious note, the latest is that we heard a leaked comment by Emmanuel Macron, possibly deliberately leaked, about how Trump might betray Ukraine, and that is not anything particularly shocking or that hasn't been discussed in recent weeks and months and couple of years, in fact. What impact do you think this comment will ultimately help? Is it just Macron's posturing to sell his own weapons to whoever he can? Is it a transformation to create some sort of a response to this yet another trap that Trump and Witkoff have eagerly, enthusiastically jumped into with the 28 point plan? Or is it something else entirely?
I think it's all of those things, but I think it's just highly hypocritical for France to throw stones at the US. when France could be doing so much more to defeat Russia and Ukraine, where hundreds of French companies are still permitted to do business in Russia, pay taxes to Russia, and where France, as a nuclear nation, does not need to fear Russia. So, uh, France throwing stones at the U.S., saying the U.S. isn't doing enough for Ukraine. I mean, that spare me.
Uh, well, thank you for this very, very thought-provoking discussion. I hope that it will attract a lot of interest, a lot of attention. Ukraine more than deserves. It has earned support and it has something of value to give in return for that support. It is not a welfare recipient. It is not a charity case. It is a potential co-producer and partner that I think will have a tremendous value for the West's strategy against future aggression, not just from Russia, but from its partners. Russia
Yes,
is part of CRINC. It's not operating on its own, lest we all forget. Um,
a hundred
so,
percent.
I hope that sober minds will prevail and see reality for what it is instead of, being stuck in a very short-term, self-serving and fantastical, in my opinion, thinking about Putin and his intentions.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Irina. Be well. Slava Ukraini.
Probably. And
Героям слава.
for those who've been watching the program, we'll be back next Tuesday night to Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much, Perry, for your time.